evening cups. The stories in this book seem to be getting a bit longer every night. Looking at the next one, it is almost 30 pages. Not bad for a short story. The one after it, I think it cooperates. The one after it is almost 40 pages. There are illustrations, but still. I believe I will read it tonight. There are only 3 left in the book, one of which being The Raven, which I read at the very beginning. I may read it again, just for the hell of it. Excuse me. Tonight's story will be The Fall of the House of Usher. The more well-known Edgar Allan Poe stories. It was a dull, dark, soundless day in autumn, and the clouds hung oppressively low as I rode on horseback through the dreary countryside that evening. I found myself approaching the house of Usher. Just one look at the house filled me with gloom. Sometimes even the most desolate and terrible sights have a kind of poetic beauty about them, but not that huge house on this evening I arrived. The bleak walls, the blank eye-like windows, and the few white trunks of decaying trees were depressing to behold. Still, I could not figure out what unnerved me, totally unnerved me, as I was gazing at the mansion. The scene had been slightly different. If the sun had been shining, for instance, it might have lost its sorrowful appearance. Nevertheless, the gloomy mansion was my destination after a journey of several weeks. Its owner, Roderick Usher, had been one of my closest boyhood friends, though many years had passed since our last meeting. I had recently received a letter from him that left me no choice but to see him in person. The writer spoke of a severe bodily illness coupled with a mental disorder that overwhelmed him. He wanted to see me, his best, and indeed only, personal friend. He hoped that the cheerfulness of my company might ease his suffering. It was the manner in which all of this was written, the heartfelt need that went with the request, that gave me no room for hesitation. I obeyed and went. As boys, we had been close, yet I really knew little about my friend. He had always been shy and reserved, even with me. I knew, though, that his ancient family had always been noted for its works of charity and its support of artists and great musicians. I learned, too, that my friend was the last male heir of the House of Usher, the name commonly given to both the Usher mansion and the Usher family. The ride up to the House of Usher was, as I have said, both terrifying and depressing. Trying to shake off the dreamlike quality of that experience, I scanned the features of the building more carefully. The most obvious thing about it was its age. The discoloration from time had been great. The fungi overspread the entire exterior, hanging like a fine tangled webwork on the eaves. Yet there were no signs that the house was falling apart. Each individual stone appeared to be crumbling, but that the house itself was intact. There was, however, a bizarrely noticeable zigzagging crack from the front of the house. It ran from the top of the building all the way to the ground to the murky waters of the small mountain lake that sulked in front of the house. When I rode up to the mansion, servants took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway of the hall. A butler of stealthy step led me in silence through many dark and intricate passages leading to his master's studio. Much that I noticed along the way heightened in vague feelings of dread that I've already described. The objects around me were familiar from my youth: carved wooden ceilings, somber tapestries, black wooden floors, and ancient armor. Nevertheless, these ordinary objects stirred dark, unfamiliar feelings in me. On one of the staircases, I met the family doctor. His face, I thought, wore an expression of low cunning. He greeted me with a wary sort of fear and passed on. The butler then threw open a door and led me into the presence of his master. The room in which I found myself was very large and lofty. The windows were long, narrow, and pointed, and so vast the distance at the black oaken floors that they could not be reached from inside the room. Feeble gleams of reddish light made their way through the panes. There was enough light to see the biggest objects in the room, but the light struggled to reach the chamber's more remote corners. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The furniture was large, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but they failed to give any life to the scene. I felt that I breathed an atmosphere of sorrow. When I entered, Usher arose from the sofa on which he had been lying and greeted me with a hearty warmth. At first, I thought he was trying too hard to make up for the surroundings, but at a glance at his face convinced me that he was perfectly sincere. We sat down, and for some moments I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely no man had ever changed so terribly and so quickly as Roderick Usher. I had great difficulty convincing him that the pale, thin being before me was the companion of my early boyhood. Yet his face had always been a remarkable one. Usher had always had pale complexion and large, luminous eyes. His mouth was thin and pale, yet quite beautiful. His nose, delicate and hooked, his chin finely molded, and his hair fine and web-like. It was hard to forget that face, but it had changed so much. All of his features were now more exaggerated. The ghostly color of his skin and the miraculous luster of his eyes started to even awe me. His hair had grown wild and now floated rather than fell across his face. Also, his manner was now alternatively lively and sullen. He spoke of his earnest desire to see me and of the comfort he expected me to bring him. He talked for some time about the nature of his illness. His family had had a long history of being extremely sensitive to all physical stimulation. He could eat only the mildest of foods and wear garments of only certain textures. The odors of flowers were oppressive to him, and his eyes were tortured even by faint light. There were only a few sounds, and those of stringed instruments, that did not inspire horror in him. He was a slave to this condition. "I must suffer in this miserable folly," he said. "I shall be lost. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident that may affect my intolerable agitation of my soul. I feel that the time will arrive, sooner or later, when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with the grim phantom of fear." He was also deeply superstitious about his house, feeling that it somehow had a powerful hold on his spirit. For many years now, he had never ventured outside of it. He admitted, however, that much of the gloom that afflicted him could be traced to a more natural cause. His tenderly beloved twin sister, Madeline, his sole companion and relative for many years, had long been racked by severe illness. Her death, he told me with a bitterness that I will never forget, would leave me the last of the ancient race of Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline slowly walked past the distant part of the huge room. Without acknowledging my presence, she disappeared. I stared after her with utter astonishment mixed with dread, though I found it impossible to account for such feelings. The Lady Madeline's disease had long baffled her doctors. She suffered from brief, intense seizures that gave her face a deathly appearance. The seizures were gradually draining her strength and making her apathetic. Just after I arrived, she gave way to the disease and became bedridden. I learned from her grief-stricken brother that the glimpse I had seen of her my first day, there would probably be the last while she was still living. For the next several days, her name did not come up. During this time, I tried hard to cheer up my melancholy friend. We painted and read together, or I listened, as if in a dream, to his wild improvised songs he played on his guitar. As we became close again, I saw the uselessness of my efforts. His mind radiated gloom. The master of the house of Usher had formed many strange opinions during his years as a recluse. For example, he believed that plants could think and feel. He thought that more objects had the same powers. He even saw those qualities in the gray stones of his own mansion. The evidence for such extraordinary claims, he said, lay in the terrible influence that had shaped his family's fate for centuries, leaving him as the sole heir. He blamed those stones for the awful state into which he had fallen. Such opinions need no comment, and I will make none. One day, Usher abruptly informed me that the Lady Madeline was dead. He also told me that he planned to keep her body for 2 weeks in the stone vault below the house. He wanted to do this rather than bury her right away in the family graveyard for 2 reasons. First, because her unusual seizures looked very much like the signs of death. Second, because he did not completely trust her doctors. When I remembered the sinister face of the doctor I had met upon the staircase the day I arrived, I had no wish to oppose this decision. At Usher's request, I helped him make the arrangements for the temporary entombment. We two alone took the body in a coffin and carried it to the vault deep below the house. That vault had been unopened for so long that our torches half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere. That made the chamber difficult to investigate, but it was clearly small, damp, and dark. It was located at great depth, directly below the room where I was sleeping. Once we had set down our mournful burden, we lifted the still unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon Madeline's face. I noticed a striking resemblance between brother and sister. Usher, understanding my thoughts, murmured a few words about the deep intimacy between twins. Our glances, however, did not rest long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease that had entombed the lady in her youth had left a faint blush upon her face. It was also left a suspicious, lingering smile upon her lips, which is so terrible in death. We shut the lid and screwed it down. We secured the vault's iron door and then made our way back upstairs into the scarcely less gloomy rooms of the house. Several days of bitter grief passed. An observable change came over my friend. His ordinary manner vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried and aimless step. His pale face took on, if possible, an even more ghastly color. His eyes were luminous no more. His voice quavered as if in extreme terror. There were times when I thought that his agitated mind wanted to release some oppressive secret. At other times, though, he seemed to simply have gone mad. He would gaze into space for long hours, as if listening for an imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his terror infected me. I felt the wild influence of his fantastic superstitions creeping up on me, slowly but certainly. I experienced the full power of such feelings after going to bed late one night. It had been 7 or 8 days since we had placed the Lady Madeline within this vault. Sleep came not near my bed. Hours ticked on and on. I struggled to reason away the nervousness that gripped me. I tried to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the influence of the gloomy furniture in the room. The dark and tattered draperies swayed fitfully in the breeze of a storm that was gathering outside. My efforts were fruitless. A tremor gradually took over my body, and a demon of utter causeless alarm sat up on my heart. Shaking myself with a gasp and a struggle, I got up, and peering earnestly into the intense darkness of the chamber, I listened. Why I did this, I don't know. An instinctive spirit prompted me to do it. I listened to certain low and indefinite sounds that came, from where I know not, the pauses in the storm. Overpowered by an intense feeling of horror that I could not explain and endure, I threw on my clothes with haste. I planned to rouse myself from the pitiful condition by pacing rapidly to and fro through the room. I had taken but a few paces when a light step on the nearby staircase caught my attention. I recognized it as that of Roderick Usher. An instant afterwards, he rapped gently at my door and entered, carrying a lamp. His face, as usual, was deathly pale, but there was also a mad hilarity in his eyes, a restrained hysteria in his face. I was appalled, but anything was preferable to the solitude I had been suffering through. "Have you not seen it?" he said abruptly, after staring about him for a few minutes. "Have you not seen it? But wait, you shall." Thus speaking, having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the windows and threw it open to the storm. The fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was a wild yet sternly beautiful night. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force nearby, and there were frequent and violent changes in the wind's direction. The clouds hung dense and low enough to touch the mansion's roof, but that did not prevent us from noticing the lifelike way in which it careened into each other without passing into the distance. There were no flashes of lightning, yet each cloud's surface and on the objects below there was an unnatural glow. "You must not see this," I told Usher, as I led him gently and firmly away from the window to the seat. "These appearances seem strange, but it's merely an electrical storm. Let's close the window. The air is chilling and dangerous for you. Look, here is one of your favorite novels. I will read, and you will listen. In this way, we shall pass the night together." I was half joking about the antique book that I picked up. It was a shallow adventure that could hold little interest for my sensitive, troubled friend. It was the only book near at hand, however, so I opened it and began to read aloud, hoping that it might distract us both. Judging by the overstrained manner in which he appeared to listen to the story, I at first congratulated myself on the effort. I had arrived at the part where the story when Ethelred, the hero, tries to peacefully enter the hut of a hermit. When that fails, the hero gains entrance by force. The passage reads, "And Ethelred, who was valiant and mighty, waited no longer for the hermit, who was stubborn and cruel by nature. Ethelred, feeling the rain upon his shoulders and fearing the rising storm, made quick blows of his mace against the hermit's door. In this way he cracked, ripped, and tore it apart. The sound of his efforts echoed through the forest." As I finished reading this sentence, I was startled by a dull noise that sounded almost exactly like the one I had just described. It seemed to be echoing from the distant part of the mansion, just a coincidence, no doubt. After all, the storm outside was causing a jumble of noises through the house. I continued reading the story aloud. But the good champion Ethelred, now entering the door, was enraged and amazed to see no sign of the cruel hermit. Instead, he saw a huge, scaly dragon with a fiery tongue. It guarded a palace of gold with a silver floor. Upon the wall there hung a shining brass shield with the motto, "Who entereth herein, a conqueror hath been. Who slayeth the dragon, the shield will win." And Ethelred lifted up his mace and struck the head of the dragon, which fell before him with a shriek, so horrid and harsh and piercing that Ethelred had to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that, in this instance, I actually did hear a low, distant, harsh sound. It sounded like either screaming or grating. I could not tell which, but it was exactly like the sound described in the book. Startled by the second coincidence, I still had enough presence of mind to avoid exciting my companion. I was not certain that he had noticed the sounds, but his expression had certainly changed in the last few minutes. He sat in a chair beside me, so I could only partly see his features. I could see that his lips trembled as if he were murmuring soundlessly. His head dropped upon his chest. Yet I knew he was not asleep because his eyes were rigidly open and he rocked from side to side in a gentle, steady manner. Noticing this, I began reading from the book again. And now the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, moved to claim the brazen shield. He hauled the dragon's carcass from out of the way and approached valiantly over the silver pavement of the castle. As he approached the shield on the wall, it fell down at his feet upon the great silver floor, setting off a great and terrible ringing sound. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if the shield of brass had fallen on a silver floor, I heard a hollow, metallic, clanging sound. Completely unnerved, I leaped from my feet, but the measure of rocking movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to his chair in which he sat. His eyes were fixed, staring before him at the room's door. Throughout his whole face there reigned a stony stiffness. Yet, as I placed my hand upon his shoulder, a strong shudder came over his whole body. A sickly smile quivered about his lips as he spoke in a low, hurried, and gibbering murmur, as if the consciousness of my presence. Bending closely over him, I heard his hideous import of his words. "Not hear it? Yes, I hear it, and have heard it. Long, and many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it, yet I dared not. Oh, pity me, miserable wretch that I am! I dared not speak. We have put her living in the tomb. Did I not say that my senses were keen? And now I tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in a hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago, yet I dared not speak. And now tonight, Ethelred, the breaking of the hermit's door, the death cry of the dragon, the clangor of the shield. I should have said, instead of the breaking of her coffin, the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, and her struggles within the metal archway of the vault. Oh, where shall I fly? Will she not be here soon? Is she not hurrying to avenge herself from me in my haste? Have I not heard her footstep on the stair? Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! Here he sprang furiously to his feet and shrieked out his syllables as if he were giving up his soul. Madman, I tell you that she now stands outside the door. It seemed as if the superhuman energy of his speech had the power of a spell. The huge antique doors to which he pointed slowly opened. It was a work of rushing and gusting wind, but outside those doors there stand a tall and shrouded figure of Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood on her white robes, the evidence of bitter struggle for every portion of her skeletal frame. For a moment she remained trembling and then reeling to and fro outside the door. Then, with a low, moaning cry, she fell heavily inward upon her brother. In her violent and final death agonies, She dragged him to the floor, a corpse, and a victim of the terrors he had experienced. From that chamber and from the mansion I fled in terror. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath, and suddenly a wild light shot along the path. I turned to see where it had come from, since the mansion was the only thing behind me. The radiance was that of a full, setting, blood-red moon. It shone through a barely noticeable large zigzag crack in the house that I had mentioned before. While I watched, this opening rapidly widened. There came a fierce breath of whirlwind, and the moon's entire radiance burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls come crashing down. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound, like the voice of 1,000 waters, and then the deep, dank mountain lake closed sullenly and silently over the last fragments of the house of Usher. Well then, children, that is definitely a good follow-up from our previous story about being buried alive. I was just thinking about it. But at least now, maybe Usher could feel peace. And now, my dear cubs, it is time for you to go to sleep. So go on, go to bed.